Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Rules of Engagement. I'm sorry we had a little bit of a delays today, but everything's all set and ready to go. And today we have a nice episode. Going to be going over MarineKing Prime versus Seed, the match that you guys saw yesterday. And if you missed it, go to youtube.com/official MLGSE2 or go to www.mlg.tv and catch up on all of our great VODs, because MarineKing vs. Seed was an amazing match. And today we're going to go over games 1, 2, and 4 from that set. Of course, with the best of 5, but I felt games 1, 2, and 4 were the ones that deserved the most analysis and are going to be the most fun to go over, and everyone can learn the most from these games as well. So going over those 3 games, and of course going to go into the series overview and viewer Q&A. So you guys can ask your questions to me on Twitter at axslav. Any questions about anything at the end of the show, we'll do some Q&A. Of course, also email replays you have that you want to be analyzed to majorleaguegaming.com/replays. Coming up in the future, there's going to be a community critique episode, so send in all those replays. We'll look them over on the show, and it'll give you a good chance to see your gameplay analyzed live on this show. You know, gone over in depth, and maybe you can learn a little bit of a thing or two from it. But now let's jump into game number 1, MarineKing Prime versus Seed. First, we'll talk about some new openings that Protoss can do in Heartless Swarm, and how a lot of new things like the Mothership Core and like new hallucination on sentries, all these new tools you can use to make a whole new opening as Protoss in Heartless Swarm. We'll talk about some early Protoss aggression, and then talk about Terran 2-based powering builds and what that type of build is, what it means, the advantages and disadvantages of such a build. So let's jump right into game number 1 here. And game number 1 is going to be starting here on Aklon Waste. We're going to start at the 6-minute mark. And we're going to go over this from Seed's point of view. And so the first thing we'll talk about is his opening. So one thing we noticed is he got the Mothership Core before he got his Nexus. So he got this core very, very early on. And then what that allows him to do is, one, yes, it delays his Nexus, right? If we pause it here, Nexus is finishing at 620 mark, whereas Terran already has their orbital done. It's already built a couple SCVs. So your command center is a little bit delayed. So it slows down the Protoss economy. But what it does do is, because he got this Mothership Core so early, we can see it already has 120 energy. That means it already has a photon overcharge. It almost has 2 time warps. And all that energy means that what you can do is you can basically defend your expansion with the core alone, and you can go very gateway light. So here at 6:30 in the game, he only has a single gateway, went straight for that robotics facility after that gateway. And what that allows him to do is tech a lot faster and be safe, because he has the Mothership Core. The other cool thing he has is that because he has hallucination over here, right? It's hallucination. What that allows him to do is allows him to scout without having to send a probe or a stalker out. And it saves him some money, and he can see exactly what his opponent's doing. He sees, okay, my opponent expanded, he has Marines, and he's building a factory near the edge of his base. All those 3 things mean, 1, there's no widow mines, there's no drop counter that's going to hit me right now, so I can move out and put on a little pressure. And because his building's so close to the edge of his base, and I have that Mothership Core now to give me high ground vision, as I go out and move out with this army, to go put on a little bit of pressure, I can basically do damage from the low ground without having to commit to enough units to break the bunker. Also, because the Mothership Core has the recall ability, I can go in there as a Protoss player, kill a few Marines, kill a few SCVs, do some damage with force fields, and then recall out before I run out of force fields. The big danger here, of course, is if you run out of force fields, even if you kill a bunch of units, right at that point, as soon as you have no more force fields, the bio army will kill you. But right here, as we can see here, kills a couple Marines here. 1, 2 Marines, does some damage. Here goes a 3rd Marine going down. And all he's losing is energy. And of course, as a Protoss player losing energy, not that big a deal, because that comes back, as long as you're not going to be attacked immediately. So right here, he can get some damage and kill a reactor on the starport, and then he can recall back at his leisure. Unfortunately, he gets a little bit bold here and says, you know what, let's try to save the energy and not recall back. But unfortunately, the Protoss units, of course, are slow. Terran units now at this point in the game have stim pack done, and with a little bit of a stim there, forces a time warp out, and then of course is still able to catch up and get that kill on the Mothership Core and force out a couple more force fields. So the attack right before he lost that core right there, if we can look at it, the units lost was just that core. If he recalled out when he was at this point right here, he would have been in great shape, because he would have had 300 resources lost from his opponent, and even more importantly than that, he delayed the reactor on the starport, which is exceptionally important, because if your opponent doesn't have that reactor, they only have 1 medevac instead of 2 at this point in the game. And each medevac adds so much power and ability of how many units can it drop on your base, how many units do you have to pull back and not have at the front of your base, but instead keep them at the back to defend those drops. So very, very useful to kill that reactor, not just in the resources lost tab, but in the timing of your opponent's tech and powerful units as they come into the game. So unfortunately missed the recall, but still, much better to have 1 medevac here than 2. And if you hit the recall, it's a really cool concept that you can put on this small amount of pressure even while you're teching very, very fast. I mean, we can see here looking at the production tab, he's already got double forges on the way, he's already at Templar Archives, and his opponent is just starting his 2nd and 3rd medevac. So very, very fast tech coming out of seed here, and he put on some pressure, and that's what we can do with Protoss now in Heart of the Swarm. A lot of cool stuff. But now let's back it up a little bit and talk about something from the Terran perspective. So a very standard opening from a Terran, a fast command center, just basic macro play. But one thing that's unique here, or not necessarily unique, but something that is interesting to point out, is MarineKing's doing something a little bit unusual, or it's unusual at the very top level play now, and that's adding a 4th and 5th barracks before the 3rd command center. So what that does is it substantially delays his economy. I mean, normally a Terran can get that 3rd up much, much faster than their Protoss counterpart, but getting the 4th and 5th barracks, what they mean is that they won't kick in until about the 11, 12, 13 minute mark until you can really get extra units out of them in significant numbers. But in that zone, the 11 to 13 minute zone, he's going to have a very, very strong army. It can threaten a kill move on to Protoss. Of course, if he doesn't get a lot of damage done, it's not like he loses the game, but he'll be worse off than he would have been if he took that 3rd base much faster. So if you want to threaten a kill move onto Protoss, which of course building the 4th and 5th barracks early means you wouldn't have the option of being able to kill the Protoss off early. If you want to do that, be sure to do what MarineKing did and get double reactors early on your barracks. The reason why this is very important is because you think about what army will the Protoss have at around the 10 to 11 minute mark. Maybe he'll have 1 Colossus out without range. Maybe even 2, depending on the build he does. Maybe he'll have, 1 Archon. Maybe he'll have Storm almost done, but he probably won't even have Storm quite done yet. Basically, what you're going to be running into is mostly basic gateway units, and Marines are much, much better against basic gateway units than Marauders. So you want to go very Marine heavy early, but then you have to acknowledge the fact that, he is going to eventually get those big power units. He's going to start to add them in. So as the battle goes on, my reinforcements, I want to be going heavier on Marauders. So your 4th and 5th barracks, those are the ones you add tech labs on. But remember, you got to get the early double reactors so you have a very high Marine count for your first initial push. And that what makes this push so scary. I mean, it's pretty normal to be ahead in supply here as Terran if you're doing a 2-base powering build, just because you're not investing much in tech. You're investing less in workers than the Protoss counterpart because you're going to have a lower worker count, you're investing more mules, and your units are much cheaper per supply, right? Marines and Marauders are 50 units per supply, 50 minerals per supply. The Marauders, 50 minerals, 25 gas per supply. Whereas a unit like the Stalker is, 67 minerals and 25 gas per supply. The Archon is very expensive per supply. Sentries are too. So you're going to have more supply. But you want that supply to be mostly Marines that are effective versus the type of army the Protoss player has. So using that type of powering atmosphere, you can come up here. If you look at the army sizes, the Terran player has a small advantage, right? 400 less in gas with this army, but of course about 800 more in minerals. Actually, that's a disadvantage in the actual battle, right? Protoss has a few units coming in here, but if you count up all these units that Terran's missing, these 2 medevacs, each 200 resources, all these units, slightly smaller army on the actual field, but because it's so Marine heavy, it's very, very effective at doing this 2-base powering build between 11, 12, 13 minute marks because Marines are so effective versus gateway units. As we can see here, what happens to Seed is, even though he's got all these Zealots, the timing is right before charge completes, and the Zealots aren't able to be very effective against this basically quantity of Marines. Even with charge, there's just too many Marines, and he would have pretty much mowed through those Zealots very, very effectively. Photon Overcharge is a great defensive tool, but it's not quite enough to defeat this whole army by yourself. So going back to the Protoss perspective, basically how did this happen? Where did things go wrong to defend this 2-base powering build? And that's where we're going to pause it and flip it back just a few seconds here to about the 10-minute mark. And the one thing that's important to note is he has a little bit less energy on these sentries than he'd like to. He still has a decent amount, but one thing he's doing is he's going light on observers. In fact, he doesn't even have a single observer. I think he built one and it got killed off by a scan. And the reason he can get away with that is because he's been using hallucination to keep tabs on his opponent. So he knows exactly what's going on. Hallucinations can keep track of draw play. They can keep track of if your opponent has a third base or not. But that also means a little bit less energy on those sentries. So if you're in a situation where you're using double hallucinations to scout at a pretty unfortunate time right before your opponent hits, you've got the mothership core, but you're worried about the draw play. You want to get it down to get the photon overcharge. And you're looking at these upgrades, and you need to stall another 80 seconds for 1-1 upgrades and about 100 seconds for charge. That's a situation where that's too long to defend by just throwing out with force fields. It may be a good idea to throw down a couple of force fields in this zone anyway. But as it is, Seed says, you know what? If I throw down a few force fields here, what's going to happen? It's going to buy me 15 seconds, because that's how long a force field lasts, is 15 seconds. But 15 seconds, I still won't finish my key upgrades. And then when he engages me, I'll have less force fields for the actual battle. I'll have one less guardian shield maybe, or something like that. So instead, I'm going to back up here and fight with photon overcharge. So the mothership core ideally is going to come down, throw that on as soon as he can tell the full force is attacking from the front. And with photon overcharge, I can cut off some of the units, use all the force fields so my zealots can connect, which is pretty good. I mean, there's only, I think, 2 zealots were unable to connect. Most of them were. And try to do the best I can. But the story there is there's too much energy used on hallucination. Ideally, you want a lot more force fields to buy that time so that you can basically get out those key upgrades and charge. So 2-base powering build from Terran, a very, very strong way as a Terran to go forward and end that game with a 2-base push. If you're doing a 2-base powering build, make sure to go double reactor marine production, and also make sure that your 4th and 5th barracks that you should start roughly around the same time, near the time that your starport is finishing up, those put tech labs on them so you rally your marauders in case that first push doesn't kill them, but often you can cripple them enough that with increased production you can at least keep them on the back foot while you eventually take up a 3rd behind your aggression. As a Protoss player here, the big problem Seed made was in that first push out. His mothership core got caught off guard by that sim time. He probably should have recalled out, would have saved himself a little bit more sentry energy, and of course, saving himself that mothership core, which is a lot of resources. Ideally, as soon as you can identify double reactors on barracks as a Protoss player, you would advance straight up to some area of effect damage. That's exactly what he was doing going for the Templar Archives. But you need to find a way to survive until you get to that point. So a lot of sentries, and use their force fields defensively. Try to avoid as much hallucination, basically as soon as you can identify to going marine heavy early on in that game. It wraps up for game number 1. It was a pretty effective powering build done by MarineKing Prime, but there's a lot of cool adjustments that Seed makes throughout this series, and MarineKing does as well. So we're going to take a short break and be right into game number 2 that I thought was pretty interesting as well.